customer life cycle is a cycle that ultimately you have to look at it in a different perspective. But that's part of the experience. Like, they don't stop their relationship with you because they reach the other side of the bow tie and now they're an advocate and then they're just like, okay, we're done. The reality is that there's a constant renewal. You've got to, sometimes you have to resell them. Sometimes you have a new product you want to talk to them about, and you have to continue go running through that cycle of the experience. So I think the bow tie is great, and I think you need to use whatever model works best for your internal executive team and your stakeholders. But from my mind, I've always looked at it more like a cycle that has a looping effect for it.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the last piece, and I just told them that I'm anti bow tie. I wasn't going to talk about it, but if you are working with a team that is quite visual, and we'll touch on this, I think, a little bit as we go along in terms of getting buy-in outside of, you can make the prettiest journey in the world, and you have to get people to actually look at it and use it. When you use a visual tool like a bow tie, it is very compelling because it helps you see it doesn't stop here. It keeps going. It is balanced. It is two-sided, and all of this wonderful scientific thought you put into the selling motion, the discovery channels, the personas, the prescriptive approach to driving the relationship, it doesn't stop when it hits that pointy bottom signature. It kind of like then comes back out and you have to think about, okay, now we have to more prescriptive and more, a leading indicator of their success and how they're part of this piece. And it really becomes almost like the reverse life cycle if you let it, but in the best way.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's like important. I think it's also a big piece of this is that I always want to touch on is the idea that if you're choosing, it doesn't matter what model you choose. It doesn't matter what framework you choose. Just choose it and stick with it. Build your KPIs around the model, build your KPIs around what you're doing, and could be consistent about it. Always stick with that model time you're going back. Your business may change. Things may adjust around it. And if there's a big thing, you may need to go back and revisit. But until then, be consistent. It's the number one part of this. And to kind of help visualize what we're talking about in terms of making this real, I wanted to very quickly, because we are running about 3 minutes over, jump into how you can make this real for you at your day job. And we've got a little bit of a presentation, and we'll throw that in. We'll send that out as soon as we're done here. So send this over, and hopefully it will. All right, there we go. So this is the guide to starting off, and I'm going to run through this very quickly, which is we want you to really have a plan around getting started with your customer journey. Starting off, making a plan for your team, making sure everyone is on board. That means from everyone from the CRO to the CFO to your head of CS down to the SDRs. Make sure everyone knows what the plan is, every single person along that entire customer journey. Establish your frameworks, as we just talked about. Really set out the rubric you want to use for the mount. Talk to everyone on the team. Like, set up time to discuss this with them, the goals, the things they're doing. Understand the success and failure points at every single stage. So when we talk about someone dropping off a map, really understand that. And then most importantly, mind the gap. The idea is people are going to fall off the face of the earth if you have a handoff that doesn't exist or isn't executed properly. And that's a great way to lose customers. And so always keep track of that. This is talking about those different models, establishing a broad path your customers are going to follow in your journey. It doesn't matter what you choose. Choose one, be consistent. And talking to everyone on the team. So your SDRs, your AEs, customer success, marketing, and most importantly, your prospects and customers. They should be on the bottom end of this, i.e., they're the last people you talk to once you know all the steps, so then you can attribute back the things they're saying with context to what your team's actually doing. And that's my opinion. Lisa, Rachel, please tell me I'm wrong.
I don't know. If you have a customer advisory board, I highly recommend getting them involved earlier, just simply because you can let them know the why and what you're doing and what you're hoping to accomplish. and then asking for their input. What parts of their experience maybe we need to drill into a little bit that weren't great, because this is about documenting what you're doing. This is about being better, right? This is
Yeah.
about giving them a better experience. So you can't just be like, this is what we do, have a nice day. It needs to be, where did we fall down? What could we do better? How can we treat our customers with a little bit more love? So yeah. I don't know if I'd say last, but I think it depends on the customer.
All right, fair enough. I'm totally, 100%. Rachel, were you going to say something? Yeah.
I'll go to the end of the spectrum with spirit. Oftentimes it's included inherently in a customer success function, but going to your support teams, going to your reactive inbound teams can also give you a really quantitative check on the noise that's happening. And hearing it is the gift itself. Not hearing it can be a problem, but it's understanding that they all stall out at a certain point, or most of our questions are about how to, put new users on the platform. Well, you didn't think about this education piece in your onboarding process, or that sort of thing. So when you're thinking about that back half of the bow tie or the post signature, however you bucket it, really look at how folks are engaging in the product and where they're getting stuck. And if you really want to get fancy, going into like your listening tools, your stories, Pendos, those types of things to watch user behavior, because that's also going to give you some good sanity checks on it. So yes, talk to people, but then also listen for the things that you don't know you're looking for. Because oftentimes, if I were to write out what I thought any given customer journey is today, it's going to be subject to my bias, to my perspective. And yes, that's why you're doing your polling, but then also listen to calls, go into your tools, look at product usage, like layer that in as well, just to pressure test that it is doing what you think it's doing. Now, that's the luxury version. Start by just getting pen to paper and getting something out there. But I think this is really important. And then knowing kind of where your risk areas are or what might change, really flagging that this is something that will change often. Like, we know we will change our signature tool 2 to 3 times this year. So like, we know that this is a piece of the map that will always be in flux or never be in flux or whatever it might be. Talking to folks and having them flag where they see opportunities, but also where they see a little bit more area of shift and change and need for change management.
Awesome. Yeah, 100%. It's like, this is a collaborative piece that this may end up seeming kind of like an Ouroboros, where it's like the snake eating its own tail as you go through it, because it's like, you're going to go talk to your team and they're going to say a thing. You're going to go, oh, I need to go talk to my customers. I need to go talk to my team. Oh, I need to go talk to my customers. And it may actually take a few iterations of this conversation for you to truly get to the source of truth around this experience.
But one thing I will caution is, I've seen this happen in a few companies, paralysis by analysis. It will never be perfect. You will always have iterations. There'll always be that one customer that didn't experience this or had a different experience, or this salesperson does this differently. So don't get caught up by perfection, because ultimately it's going to capture 85 to 90% of the reality of your customers. Ones that don't experience that, you need to ask yourself why. Right? Why was it better, or why was it worse? And you can learn from those experiences too. But yeah, to Rachel's point, I've never talked to an inbound customer success person that didn't have advice on what we could do better with our customers, ever. So yeah. Sorry, James.
Measure twice.
Going.
Measure twice, cut once, and know that you're good at your job to know that cut is probably good enough.
Right. Yeah.
And like, know the key entry and exit points. It's like, how did they get here? What are the inputs? What did you do to get them here? What was the action step they took? What were the needs they had getting to this point? What's involved in each of these steps? Like, what does that experience look like? Is it a sales touch? Is it a handoff? And it seems like some things are missing from here, but that's fine. Marketing touch, calls, discovery. And then from an exit criteria standpoint, Like, what does it look like, to Lisa's point, when that customer says, you know what, I'm out, I'm done? Like, how are you handling that scenario versus how are you handling the scenario where the customer may be disqualified or is no longer a fit by your own admission for your company? And this can happen at every stage. Allow for instances at even people that are currently paying you money to say, this customer is not a fit for us, and build that into your model. And then, as mentioned here, always look at your handoff. Like, every single stage, every time a customer changes hands, always look at those steps and make sure you're always back to A, the customer experience, and B, the KPIs that are being tracked. I generally use, I threw my model on here, which is value, volume, velocity, and conversion. In every single stage, how much value is being driven, how much volume are we getting through it, how much velocity, how fast are people going through, and how often are we converting? And again, we'll send these out after, so no reason to screenshot them, Eric.
Always a good student.
Yeah. And anything, well, before I go forward, anything on this slide? Or does this kind of feel like cool? And then always understand four things every single stage of the journey: the entry point, the in-step experience, the exit criteria, and where is it tracked. Basically gives you a data map of your entire customer journey as long as you track these various things. And then map it. What should the overall process capture every single step, no matter how small, no matter how insignificant? Make sure you're capturing this, make sure you know what it is, and you're able to say the varying attachments within this, if they are, as you see with that sentence-based nurture, entirely detached from any particular stage. Make sure you capture them and then are able to attribute them to certain stages of the process. And finally, mind the gaps, whether they're known unknowns, technology gaps, customer experience gaps, or personnel gaps on your own team. It's always know, we always talk about people, process, strategy, and tech. And it's like, know those things, know where they land, and be ready to make sure you do it. And again, I'll send this when we're done. But thank you. All right. Now, like, one big thing, once you've completed this process and gotten that customer journey mocked up, it's like, I just showed a kind of framework that I've used, but like, where are the places that you think this could look different? Or how would you go down the path of doing it by stage, or doing it by like scale of company, or doing it by sales motion, those kind of breakdowns that we see in every company I've ever worked with? Lisa, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to consider all the factors for your individual company, right? Whether it be stages, departments, et cetera. And you have to clearly outline that before you just dive into it. And each stage needs to have activities, expectations, and actions. And I know Nick had a question in the Slack about this, or I said Slack, the chat, sorry, habit, of the different scale and how scale plays into that. And I think that that's a really important nuance. Your systems, tools, and people look vastly different. Your resources are different when you're at a startup. So when you look at scaling, you have to scale this customer journey map as you scale. This is not a static thing. It needs to be, you need to come back to it. And so I think when you look at this, you have to consider where you are in your growth stage, where you're headed, right? And from RevOps people, we're expected to see around corners. So I think when you look at the process and say, what are we going to be doing 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now, that we're going to be doing differently? And this can actually help you build a case to say, we need additional heads here, or we need additional tools here. And here's the value that it would provide to our customers itself. So I think each step of the journey clearly outlined, activities, expectations, and actions. But those departments and stages are going to look very different by size of company, by verticalization. You've got vertical SaaS and horizontal SaaS, and they look really, really different from a customer journey because one's a jack of all trades and one's a specialist. So you've got to be able to consider all of the factors for your individual company.
And I'll add to that to say, you start with what's in common across. So from two different lenses. One, ends of if you have several different customer profiles and who you're selling. So start with kind of what are the shared milestones, and then let that be a shared language across the maps for those, maybe you have an e-com version of your product, and then you have an enterprise version of your product, and maybe a couple of steps in between. So what are the things that are similar across the board? And then add the variety in between to see if you can stitch together this a little bit of apples to apples. And then the other thing I'll say is, just as a word of caution, oftentimes operators have a bit of a in us. And so we either don't want to publish something until it's perfect, or we want to, get stuck. We've mentioned it in this analysis paralysis. And so going to company stage, if you are in a early or high growth stage as a business, I encourage you to intentionally don't make it perfect. Don't codify it. Don't laminate it, right? Like, this is something that you need to be drawing in pencil and constantly revisiting in such a way that you account for flexibility and you account for change, versus saying, this is what we're going forward with. I just spent 2 weeks of my time building this beautiful color coded, flow swim lane chart, and you can get really caught up in the details there. So word of caution to the operators to keep it as agile as appropriate, and so you can constantly use it as a tool rather than an anchor.
Yeah. Keep it simple. Keep it simple and keep it right. Like, that's basically what I've seen, which is every single time I go through this, it's how can I make this as simple as humanly possible so everyone across the board gets it and makes that adoption easier.
Well, and I think there's also you have to give a nod to the level of detail that specific departments want. RevOps wants all the details, right? And so, but when you goes to your CMO, when you're walking your CMO through it, they're not going to want to see all the process behind it. They're going to want to see, what is the customer experiencing? How does this affect our branding? I mean, I think this is a really powerful branding exercise for CMOs, by the way, for them to understand that, like, hey, there's a lot coming at these customers throughout the customer life cycle. Is it consistent? So I think that's there's got to be multiple versions, but using the same visual to what we were talking about earlier, like same visual shit. Like, your CEO should immediately look at that slide and know that that's your customer life cycle. That's what we're talking about. But the level of detail behind it, and oftentimes I've used Lucidchart with like the drill downs where you can click into it and go to the actual process map, so that RevOps people like me that love a good Lucidchart can dive into the details, but someone can look at the overarching view and just see it as a system. So
that makes perfect sense. And I think that actually ties directly into one of our questions, and also the next two questions that we have here, which are like, it's all about, what do you do once you completed the journey? Like, how do you get consensus, and how do you utilize it? And then the question that was asked, which is related to this, which is, what are the most common downfalls and issues you see in your journey? Not just documenting it, but actual experience of doing it and using it.
Do you want me to jump in? Oh, go ahead, Rachel.
I'll see if we're on the same page. It boils down for me to lack of alignment of expectation. And then there's two layers that you have that expectation that you need monitoring for. One is between the company and the client, and then one is within the company. So a little bit about how to make sure that internally folks are seeing the same thing, because if they don't, you have that clash of an ask, and maybe you're asking for a testimonial on the same day that you're sending out the renewal notice, or you're just the clash of expectation on the inside is the first place that you can fall down. And then the next piece is that you design a process that is aspirational in nature, that you create a customer journey that is not real, and that you expect something of your customer that they're either unable to fulfill or unaware that they need to fulfill. And it's a bit vague, but I would pressure test, map it out, and then it's a little bit of a to Nick's other question, the data piece. Map it out and then see if you can fit back if that's been happening or why not. So if part of your journey is that they get onboarded in their first 90 days so that they have all of their users using tool exclusively. Well, look to see, is that actually happening? Why or why not? And then understand, is that a missed expectation? Is that reality? Do you need to level set? Is where you want to be? So put it on paper, make sure everybody can sing the same tune, and then constantly check back, is this aspirational or is this real? Because oftentimes there's this disconnect of what we think is happening versus what is actually happening. And that's the fastest place that you fall down, because you're solving for the right problems at that point.
Yeah, and I would say one of the other challenges, I've done this with multiple companies, and one of the biggest, challenges or problems that this exercise often highlights is on the front end of the sale, we talk about personas, how to approach them, value, the value that they receive, but yet they all flow into one singular pathway post. And so really, if you've talked to them about, this is going to save you money, or this is going to, increase the efficiency of your team, or whatever that value prop is that you just sold them, the reason why they bought your solution, there needs to be a pathway given to them to say, we're going to take you down the pathway. We're going to make sure that you realize the value that you purchased. So I think that's one of the things that I see a lot of the value dies at signature, and then they just get put on the carousel that they're expecting, like they get implemented exactly like everybody else. And that's not ultimately what they need. The other thing is enablement is a big part of it. It tends to highlight areas where we've made assumptions around their knowledge or capabilities. And this is really, really important when you're dealing with a variety of sophistication. So if you have low sophistication buyers, right, this might be the first SaaS product they've purchased, or the first software that they're really using or putting into their tech stack. If you're an early stage type of software, there's a very different pathway to take than when you're talking to, we're implementing this with your IBMs, right? That have the teams, that have the resources. And so I think that there's also a consideration that has to be made for what are the resources of the customer, because we make it sound all rosy and easy to implement, use, and renew our product, and you're going to love us forever when they're being sold. But the reality of it is we've got to make that true, right? And are we making that true, or are we just telling them that, and then we have the gotchas during the implementation phase that are really highlighted? That how can we sell around that and make sure that they're aware of it so they're not surprised? Because to Rachel's point about a disconnect between expectations and reality, that's huge, right? There's a trust factor there. If they were expecting one thing and they get another, lose a little bit of faith, and over time, death by 1,000 paper cuts, you end up with a churned customer. So I think it's really important to highlight those things.
And we've got 2 minutes left. And so with our final 2 minutes, I wanted to ask a question that is kind of have a question in the chat. And then we have our final question, which is, how do you maintain this when it rolls out? And how do you see the owner of this process driving iteration and feedback?
So as I say, this is where I think it depends. And I know everyone hates that answer, but it depends. If you have a revenue operations team that is truly revenue operations and covering the full go-to-market from engagement all the way through to renewal, it can be owned by that team. However, a lot of times there's a disconnect between it with the business side of things. So you've got to make sure that you have plenty of stakeholders. I find RevOps is a little bit better from a discipline standpoint. They're going to iterate like, hey, it's this day of the year, we're going to start this process and make sure that we've updated this customer journey. But I don't think that's always the case. Sometimes there's a customer experience within a company that is super passionate about this, and making sure that they own that is important, because they'll get frustrated if they own the customer experience but they don't own the customer journey. There's going to be frustration there. So I think it depends.
I think early on, it's, if you can pull it off, a unofficial board or a advisory committee. Super unofficial. You can even just make it a Slack group that has like a pinned Lucid chart where people conversation. You don't have to really overthink this thing. But to that end, having those different experiences, you always will have a champion that just really cares. But then having the folks around them that add comments is a really valuable way to make constantly staying updated. And to Matt's question, ops versus enablement, you have to be in lockstep there. And sometimes they're in the same reporting structure, which might make it easier. But if they're not, you want your messaging to be aligned the journey. Are we hitting them with the right messages at the right time? Are we pushing in the right areas? Are we being prescriptive? Enablement to me is all about educating people to be prescriptive, and I'm proud of this job. But it's really kind of creating this environment that you think works best and works in most favor for your customers, and that is driven off this backbone of what it should be and how you can get there in one piece.
Awesome.
Okay, we're gonna get kicked off, or do I have one more thing to add about ops?
You can jump in one. We can do one more thing. Let me get this thing out of Rachel's face, or try to. All right, there we go.
Download today.
Just really quick, I would say, and the first time you do this, you're going to have changes to make. And that is where ops and enablement need to hold hands and go down that pathway together, because you're going to have to drive behavior change. And typically enablement, has the tools and the way of doing that, where ops, oftentimes our approach is we'll just stop doing that and start doing this. And we have to really be able to hold their hands, because these are big changes. They're psychological changes in some cases. So I think it's a partnership. It's a arm in arm. And I'm a big believer in ops and enablement under this heading because of that reason, because they can ebb and flow together. So I think that's kind of my perspective on the ops versus enablement.
I wholeheartedly agree and have no notes. I think this was great. Thank you both for joining today. Thank you, everyone who came. We'll be sending out the recording. Full disclosure, it didn't start recording until 20 minutes in, but we will figure that one out to this. Thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Lisa.